Clearly, we cannot get that one encompassing symbol or image to represent what liberation is for everybody. But it is perhaps an invitation to start somewhere. And to ensure that when we use the term liberation, that we are not juxtaposing it with images of the opposite, images of our oppression, our colonization, our containment, that we are actually challenging ourselves to create a whole visual language around this new concept. And I say a new concept because we're all convinced that we have yet to achieve this thing called liberation. Right? So there's two ideas being thrown out here. Idea number one is that we are in desperate need a more visual connection to what liberation is or could be or should be for us and what it is that we're trying to achieve. And the other idea being that liberation is not this distant state of being, but rather a practice that we must begin embodying in thought, feeling, and action from this very moment. Saludos and welcome to the Rematriating Borikén podcast, where we discuss the journey to the essence of these islands, this archipelago and her surrounding waters, the restoration of our essence before conquest and continued colonialism, the reclamation of our collective healing and liberation. I am Yasmín Hernández, creator of Cucubanación, artist, writer, activist, born and raised in Brooklyn, Rematriating Borikén. What does liberation look like? And this is more of a hypothetical conversation. If anything, it's mostly prompts to get us as individuals and as collectives to consider this question more. Clearly, what my liberation looks like may not be what it looks like to you. And so it's something that we should each be asking ourselves. So I'm not here to tell you what that actually looks like. This is a response to a Trinchera de Ideas conversation that we had last week with the same theme. And so we're going to let it flow with a reflection on how we should be doing more work around contemplating what liberation could and should look like for us. Defining that for ourselves so that we could more easily create a vision of it. And if we have that envisioned, it becomes easier to embody it and practice it. It's been a pattern of different conversations around liberation. The first conversation on liberation happened in June, on Juneteenth, on June 19th. In September, we discussed Boricua liberation. Back in, I think, February, there was one on Black liberation and rematriation. And this summer, I was called to consider how to create content around what liberation looks like. So what had happened was I was in the ocean sometime this past summer. And one of our favorite family activities that we started participating in a lot more last year and since is snorkeling. My children take after me. I grew up in Brooklyn going to Rockaway Beach, and those waves were not very welcoming, let's just say. So I grew up with a respect for the ocean, of respecting it from afar. Respetándola, she's beautiful de lejos. I brought that same sense here, even though here I find the water to be so much more welcoming and warm and pleasant. I still had this sense that I needed to ease into it, right? And so my children did not grow up like their father, who was very much a fish. They grew up like their mother. And then our youngest opened up more and more over the years to the water and is swimming a lot more confidently. My oldest was still como que very timid around the ocean like I was. And then eventually we just figured out as a family that we all needed to participate in snorkeling together. My husband and I would do it from time to time, but never involve the kids. And once we started to snorkel, then everybody became a fish. That was just like all boundaries were dissolved. And we are a lot more confident in the water. My youngest, he loves doing somersaults under the water. And I get to watch this and I get to just see him suspended there. And I know I started out talking about liberation. I'm going to make this all connect in a second. I see us suspended there. I see my son who has really long hair. His hair is up to like his waist under the water. Like the ends of his hair in the sun have this like red highlight. And so the way that color and light is perceived through the water is very unique. It's very different than on land. And I love this idea of playing with boundaries, or how people talk about new ways of seeing and being. If you want a new way of seeing and being, there's no better way than to immerse yourself in the water, which forces you to see and be in a different way. So here I am watching my son take a new form in the water. He's no longer nervous to be under there. Watching my youngest son doing these somersaults like a little fish, like a little shrimp, un camaroncito, dando vuelta on the water. And what I could perceive in them is this freedom, is this complete suspension. Watching them, watching us be so free under there. And from feeling free, from feeling like we had no concern in the world, from feeling literally weightless, because that's how you feel in water. You feel lighter, you're floating. I understood at that moment that the sense of freedom and liberation is something that we must embody, that we must feel, not just think about, not just read about, not just dream about. It's what would that feel like in here? Part of colonialism is being separated from our own bodies, separating from our own sense of feeling. Oppression works to disconnect you from your own self. And this constant state of survival mode has you thinking, reacting, and often not here, not in your heart, not in your body, not feeling. So that is also how apathy builds, so that you can live these atrocities in this world, like genocide happening in Gaza and all these atrocities we're witnessing from the Sudan to the Congo to wherever, where have you, or even here in Puerto Rico. If we don't feel, then we can just walk around numb. And if we are numb, then we're not going to challenge things. We're not going to bring things into questioning. We're not going to hold people around us accountable of the things they do and the stuff we are forced to live at their hands or at their poor decisions. And so I think that we developed this survival tactic of avoiding feeling, avoiding sitting with something in the body and the discomfort of something. And the response to that, or the side effect of that, is that we just go around like lashing out at people. We're just like angry. We don't know about what. We're just like reacting to each other, and we're very reactive, and we're very maybe moody because there are things happening that we cannot control, and we're frustrated, but we haven't sat with what that discomfort means and how that upset triggers us within, right? So this idea of being suspended freely underwater, and I am watching this, and I'm also living the double experience of being immersed, submerged in the water, and then every now and then just picking up my head and hearing the caravanas of cars go by with reggaeton, right? Because this beach is up against the road. Lifting my head up to hear what's happening around me on land with our people, submerging my head to hear, what do I hear down there? My own breath. I'm connecting. It becomes meditative because what I hear is the sound of water and the sound of my own breath. What I'm seeing in front of me are my children floating and rolling like fish. And at that moment, the words, it's like if someone spoke this into my mind, and it was, this is what liberation looks like. And I understood that for us to live a constant survival mode, a constant reactivity to all the triggers that we live in our day-to-day life, the freedom of that experience of being suspended in water was connecting us to another possibility. And that possibility is, I'm going to throw a scientific word, which is homeostasis. Homeostasis is when your body is at its relaxed state. Your breathing is at its relaxed state. Your heart rate is at a resting state or calm. When we are triggered or in survival mode, our pulse increases, our breathing increases. Your body is preparing for fight or flight. After I got out of the water that day, I went to the sand. Yo siempre cargo con una libretita, and immediately I just started writing notes. And I think I wrote a poem there. And the idea was, this is what you're being called to do. You're being called to consider, what does liberation look like? What does liberation feel like in your body? Because most conversations around liberation are geared or centered on what is that struggle, or what is the enemy? Who is the enemy? Who is keeping us outside of this liberated state? Who is getting in the way of our achieving liberation? Some people have even had this conversation from the standpoint of, who do we need our liberation from? How do we participate in this process of organizing to ask for our liberation, which is it's not something I believe. I believe that if I am to take my liberation from someone, then I'm acknowledging that they have a supremacy over me, and it's not something I believe. So if I believe that liberation is something that is our natural birthright, that we already come with, and here there's systems in place and structures in place societally that can keep us from that liberation, then my connection to liberation cannot come from a place of asking for it or centering it around what the colonizer does and doesn't do to us. My understanding of liberation needs to come from right here, that place that I have been disconnected from via colonialism and the shit that we live under it every day. Living several days a week without water, losing power on a whim. And when we lose power on a whim, not having access to work, not having access to connection, the inflated prices that we pay for food, and so many other things. So the inspiration to talk about, what does liberation look like? Liberation is not going to look for me like it might look for someone else. But the call that I felt from the water that day, I always talk about my teachers. I'm not guided by a leader. Take me to your leader. I'm not guided by a leader. I'm not guided by a party. I'm not guided by a political organization. I am now guided by the land. That is my process in rematriation, is that the deepest lessons that I receive from the land and the elements themselves, be they land, be they water, be they wind, or bioluminescence. It was a call to lead my work moving forward with that question, with that reflection. What does liberation look like? What is that? People talk about wanting this thing, but if this thing were to be achieved, what would that be? Most people are afraid to even engage in a conversation around liberation. They think that it's some radical shit that they don't want to get in trouble for discussing. For those who do talk about liberation, then it's like this, it's like love, right? Everybody talks about love and claims to be in love, but how many of us actually sit down to discuss and unpack what love is? And even in its diverse expressions, even in our wide definitions of what love can be, how do we come together and claim to be in these relationships of love when we haven't even had a discussion of what we think love is? And if we don't know what love is and what we expect from love, how do we expect to be in these relationships in a fluid, reciprocal way if we don't even have an understanding of what that means for each of us or the other? Or ourselves oftentimes haven't even determined what that is. So in the same way, that we see so many clashes in romantic relationships or friendships or even family that is supposed to be immune and everyone's supposed to love each other and just get along fabulously. But so many families have such toxicity and hypocrisy because there's not an ethic. There's not a love ethic. People talk about a love language, and I'm wary of the love language conversation because I think that a love language is a way of getting around really talking about what the heck love means to us. So if somebody, cooking is their love language, or buying gifts is their love language, but these are all material things. And so if we had nothing to give and we had nothing to do or provide for one another, what would love be? What would love be if it came from just us alone, right? What is that? And what does love mean for you? What does love mean for me? What do I hope to get out of love? What do I give with it? And until we really know these things or attempt to discuss them to arrive at some understanding, how can we achieve it? And so the same way that I've been having these contemplations around love, now I'm being called to enter that depth, that abyss of, so what is liberation for us? And what does that look like? And understanding that it's going to look like many different things to different people. How are we to achieve something that we haven't even crystallized in our own minds yet? And it's not to say that we can know exactly what liberation should be if it's something we have yet to achieve. But if we continue to center these conversations around the colonizer, the oppressor, the unjust systems that contain us, then how do we ever transcend that? How do we ever transcend those conversations when everything we discuss and the structures that we are building for ourselves are in reaction to what they do to us? And if some of us are talking about dismantling these oppressive systems, then what do we put in its place? And it's not that work happens and then we do this. It's that there needs to be a seamlessness, that we're already building something. It's at the point that these systems will dismantle themselves by the unsustainability of the lovelessness that they thrive off of. And so while that is happening and while they self-destruct, because when you give destruction, then that's what you are bringing and calling into yourself. Is simultaneously we need to be envisioning, embodying, and practicing our liberation. It's not something that, certainly, it's not something we're going to vote for. If that is your belief, then maybe this isn't the podcast for you. Because yo no puedo hablar lo que no creo. Yo voy a ser honesta y I'm going to speak authentically from what my heart believes. And I recognize that there's a lot of ways to come to this conversation. I'm not saying that people who have a difference of opinion cannot engage in this conversation with me, or that I'm not willing to engage in that conversation with, but I am not here to guide people on an electoral process towards liberation. This is not what you're going to hear on this podcast. So I'm just being transparent so that you could determine what you're going to invest your time in and whether you want to hear what is offered here. The folks who I respect and believe spoke to liberation as a practice that we can engage in daily from this moment, from the moment, as Betances said, que querer ser libre es empezar a hacerlo. As soon as we connect to the desire to be free, that's where we begin this process towards our own respective liberation. It's not when a referendum is had and however many years later that referendum is actually honored and then liberation is granted. It is something that we can choose to practice right now. And so my belief is, how do we practice something that we haven't envisioned? As an artist, for me to paint something, I need to have at least a general idea in my head of what that should look like. Many times I do approach painting that I'm called to do, and I may not have the slightest clue what that is going to look like, but there is a general call. There is a general inspiration whether it be, okay, you're going to do a portrait of Luisa Capetillo or whoever. And I know aesthetically the style that I'm going to present it in. And there is a component of that is my responsibility. And I also think that there's a component of that comes from elsewhere, donde yo entiendo that when I paint an ancestor, oftentimes esa pieza se pinta, right? That piece renders itself. And I am a sort of intermediary to bring it forth. But I don't come to a blank canvas with zero ideas. Like, I have a sense of what I'm to do there. And I'm not going to come to that canvas until I have a general idea of what's going to happen. And so I guess my idea is that instead of just focusing so heavily on what it is that we don't want to see and the oppression that we don't want to see and the actions that we have to do to counteract what we are seeing by the powers that be, those that are wanting to be in domination and in control, then what is born from that is going to be something that is at a similar vibrational level to that which we're trying to do away with. If we are trying to create something new and something that is authentically ours, and that speaks to our needs and our authenticity as a collective, then that should be informed by our own restful, beautiful state, not a state of survival, because what comes from that is governed by the needs of survival. It comes from a place of scarcity where we then end up replicating that which we are trying to break from. And it is what we have seen through so many revolutions across the 20th century of newly liberated republics falling into civil wars and unrest and fighting themselves, because so much of it was informed by fighting an enemy and not enough went into coming to a common place here in the psyche, here in the heart, that you get this so-called freedom, and then you have no idea what that means for you as a people. And so it could be very abstract to consider, what does liberation look like, right? For me, I had this call while floating in the water. And people might be like, oh, eso bien romántico, like, what the hell does liberation have to do with floating in the water? Look at Gaza. What was one of the tactics with Gaza was criminalizing any approximation to the sea. It's cutting people off of their lifeline. And that is both symbolic and literal. So whether it's symbolic as water, as sea, as salt water, como la fuente, como la matriz, like the womb, like, where we are held, where we are gestated, how we are born, or whether it is the practicality and the materiality of fishing those waters for sustenance, for nourishment. Why does keffiyeh have a fishnet pattern on it? Because this is a people that live between the river and the sea. And so fresh water and salt water is what incubated and held the Palestinian people. So part of colonization is knowing that and connecting people off of their supply, their life, their source. And that is disconnecting you from the water, disconnecting you from the olive trees, whatever is sacred. And what is sacred is life. It is all the life-giving forces. It's the water that gives energy and life, that gives the fish to feed ourselves, or the olive trees. That is the basis and foundation of this cuisine. And so it's very symbolic to be floating in the water, which is the essence of life, the essence of the womb. I call this island Borikén my womb. Though I wasn't born here, it is where my mother, my parents, my grandparents were born. Obviamente me va a llegar esa contemplación ahí mismo, en las aguas saladas, ¿verdad? in salt water is where I'm going to have this contemplation on liberation. Because for those of us who think that this is romantic and this is too idealistic, think about what we have been subjected to as a collective, as a people, when we are no longer connected to the sea. That becomes abstract and shit. And then people feel at home in the concrete. We had, as I called it, some freak ass baby hurricane that woke everybody up. and the weird thing is that I'm in bed and next to my husband, we're like, what the hell is going on? And it's not from a place of fear. It's like everything comes to a screeching halt. And it's already become this place where there is an awe with which we witness nature. It's like, detenete, because Mother Nature is here. She's doing her thing. Step aside. Step aside and watch. That's all you could do. It looks like aliens done invaded our these islands, because it was like a complete light show. It looks like we're being attacked from outer space, and we're just like, what the hell? And I had just gone to sleep like an hour ago, a little too late, knowing that I had to wake up at 6 o'clock in the morning. I went to sleep later than I should have, and within an hour, here's Mother Nature, like, despiértate, I'm here, bitches. And when my son woke up, my oldest son, he wakes up with his eyes all big, like, lo mismo, what the hell was that? Goes to the window, flings the curtain open. He's like, look at that. Right? The sky was super dark. Not because, the sun had already risen, but towards the horizon, towards the west, el cielo estaba bien oscuro. Like, that system was out over the water. He's like, viste? Like, what the heck was that? Exactly. And then when I'm driving him to school, immediately he's like, I want to see, yo quiero ver el culebrina. I want to see the culebrina, which is the river that supplies our water. And I'm just trying to focus on this traffic and getting him to school on time. And when we drive past the river, he's like, look at the culebrina. It's so full. He's like, look how full it is. He's like, look, it's so full that there are these islands that are usually there on the banks of the river, and they're gone. Everything is on the water. And I just, as I'm driving, I'm thinking, wow, like, what a victory that this 16-year-old kid, le importa. He cares about the river. He looks at this river. He observes the water line, the water levels, and cares that the river will overflow, or cares that the river is just flowing much more abundant, or that it could flow over. And what that usually means for us is that it'll clog the filtration system, and then they just shut down the water supply. And then we'll be without water for 3 days while they figure out how to unclog the supply, so that this is what happens. This is what we know. And I'm not saying that that is liberation. But what I'm saying is that the path there certainly is to realign, is to reattune to what is source, what is life. Importarnos de lo importante. That all of our energy and resources and skills and efforts and work and energy are not going to what the colonizer is doing, but that we are attuning to what the winds and the waters and the rivers are doing, and understanding that we are focusing on our own natural rhythm. Connecting to that rhythm is what's going to connect us to our bodies and know what doesn't feel good, what feels good. Because what liberation should be is what feels good. It's not all that shit that keeps us in a state of survival, in a combative state. Because a lot of us are walking around in a combative state, and instead of directing that energy towards who it needs to be directed at, we direct it at ourselves and at each other. So that's a wasted energy. A lot of us are just walking around angrily, and since we cannot necessarily direct that directly where it needs to go, then it just stays inside and it just poisons us and poisons our bodies from within. And so just this idea of what it means to practice realigning to lands, like The only people who allow themselves to have these conversations are those who identify as indigenous. And why is that? And we are all part of this land, or a land. We are all born on lands. We are all nourished by lands and from lands. And yet so many of us are walking around so disconnected and out of alignment from what surrounds us, from what sustains us, and are instead walking a life of combat. Yet that combat is not directed at any particular thing that will result in that which we are wanting, if we know what we are wanting, because so many of us are focused on the combat that we have no effing idea of what it is that we are working towards. What is that light? What is that path? And again, as so many people have taught me, as Elisam Escobar said to me, what liberation is a practice. It is not a state of being that you are now and now you are not liberated. It is a choice that you make to embody and to practice. And that if enough of us made that choice, and if we make it as a collective, then it will be a much more easy and efficient process. So this is just an invitation on connecting to what the hell is it? What is it that we are desiring? So that we could start envisioning it. And if we have that vision and we have that image, just like I need to have a sort of remote image in my head of knowing what I'm going to arrive at a canvas to paint. And if we could arrive at that conversation with some sort of image unfolding, or at least a mental sketch, then it becomes easier to render it. It becomes easier to complete it, to create it. So to help prompt a visual of my experience with water and what inspired this search, this theme of what does liberation look like, I'm going to share the poem that I wrote that day after having this experience in the water. Freedom is floating at the surface, face down, staring into her blue light. Sound of my own breath pulsates through my body. An occasional rumble from beyond grows. I lift my head and reggaeton beats seep into my ears. Submerged again, lured by fish in yellow and black stripes, the little cobalt blue dory-looking fish, black fish with fancy fins like ruffled wings, silver ones, turquoise and yellow. Freedom is floating underwater with my two sons, weightless, suspended in salt water. As they once were in my womb, I step into her womb with them. Us three float as triplets of the sea, rolling, curling in her currents. It is a new way to play, a new way to mother my own self. All of us rolling in blue light, free like the sea. And we all know that mother really means home. To help further this visual, I want to mention an artist named Khalida Rawls. Khalida, C-A-L-I-D-A, Rawls, R-A-W-L-E-S. And this sister has beautiful, beautiful, soothing, empowering portraits of Black people mostly floating underwater, floating in water, underwater, through water. All of her paintings are of different shades of Black and brown skin as seen through water. And most recently, I just seen the video of hers. I just looked it up right now as I was getting ready to record this poem, and found that she's working on a series now where she's painting through dark water. And for her, it is a reference to the political uncertainty and the escalating political mess and uncertainty in the US in these times. And this idea of moving through water, that there's a nervousness attached to it, but this need and this exciting idea that you move anyway, right? The courage, la valentía, that through uncertain times we're still being called to move, to act, to do, to be. Her other pieces around water also speak to this idea of the freedom that we feel in water. Conversations about people of color and water. I've had this experience here myself one time, snorkeling. On Valentine's Day, my husband and I decided to have a little date where we would go snorkeling together. And the water was very choppy that day. The water was February. Obviously, the water in Puerto Rico in that time is much more, here in El Oeste, is more surfing season. It's not like very calm snorkeling type waters. And I was struggling let's just say that. But next to me was this white American family that was snorkeling with their little children. And these kids were mad small. And they were out there with their fins and their masks like professionals. And it really highlighted for me this notion, this idea of what it meant for me to grow up in Brooklyn. Like how many of our families would make it out to the water? How many of us could take swimming lessons or snorkeling lessons, or even how many of us are certified to scuba dive? And it reminds me of a story of another New Yorker living here in Puerto Rico who spent most of her life going back and forth until she chose to move here. And that is Aimee Montoya, who talked about, and this really stayed with me, how when she was a kid, her father was sure to get her scuba diving certification because it was important to him that she know as much as Puerto Rico as possible, and that she would understand and have a sort of mastery of beyond La Isla, the water and being underwater. And I thought that was such a brilliant thing for her father to do, and felt similarly about how my children are not growing up as Brooklyn kids as their mom did, or as Queens kids as their father was. Son isleños, and they're growing up in the Caribbean. And swimming was something that we had to figure out, even pushing past my own fear. It was something that we have to figure out. So for us as a people, as Afro-descendant people, and all that water means for us, to us, water was both womb y tumba. That has been a meditation of mine for this month of October. Water could be the womb, and it's also the tomb for millions that were sent overboard, or for those who chose water. It's the same way as water could mean treachery and betrayal and kidnap through chattel slavery. Water was also life-giving. Water was a force of life. Water for us has been a mysterious place, has been sometimes a separating and imprisoning place. Water has also meant for us connectivity. And it has also meant for a lot of ancestors of ours of freedom, for those who chose to jump to the water rather than persist on a slaver ship, knowing what that, and not knowing what they were living at the moment, and not knowing what lied ahead on the other side, but having a pretty good idea based on the experience of that journey. And so to reclaim the water, as Khalida Rawls does in her work, I hope I'm pronouncing her name correctly, and for me, who has also been drawn to the water in my own painting as well, in my spirituality, and also in my practice of how water let me know this past summer that it is a source and a space for us to practice liberation in, as it was for our ancestors and as it needs to be in the future. The way we move through water, reclaim water, and connect to water has a lot to do with how we envision and practice liberation, especially considering that our ancestors, both African and indigenous, were navigators, especially the indigenous ones of these islands, of these archipelagos of the Caribbean, were navigators. They built their canoas, filled them with dozens and dozens of people. A canoe is not, first, that word being indigenous to this region. People in the US have this sense of a canoe being like this romantic ride with two people on a stream. But here in the Antilles, a canoe could hold sometimes up to 100 people. So think about these colossal trees that were being carved to make these embarkments, and that this is how they navigated from island to island. We are people of the water. And if we live with a fear of the water, then that is a way that colonialism has also worked to keep us contained, keep us suppressed, right? We have access to those waters and a familiarity of the waters, then we have access to sustenance. We have access to who we are, the essence of our archipelagic selves, that it's not a political border that ends with our coastline. It's not a political border that ends with one island, as they try to have us believe. It is a whole archipelago with the fluidity that goes from island to island to island, that united, those waters united our ancestors across these islands. They didn't separate them. They didn't disjoint the fluidity of a people. It united them.
Now that I'm talking about this theme of the history of water for our people, I am reminded of this recent issue of the Centro Journal of the Center for Puerto Rican Studies, titled Waterproof Olas de Memoria, or Waterproof Waves of Memory, guest edited by Sarah Bruno, Isa Diaz, Daniel Morales Armstrong, and Jessica Marie Johnson. So all scholars of Black Puerto Rican studies, and of which I am beyond overjoyed to be a part of, with the publication of my creative essay, Painting Rematriation, Reflections from Year 10 in Borikén, where I do mention the rematriating Borikén portraits. And I also talk about the role of bioluminescence and of the waters, right? In navigating this diasporic existence and this journey back to the archipelago. Other pieces in this collection, some of the titles here: Recuerdo, Blackness, Memory, and the Racial Contract in Puerto Rico by Shanti Rosado. Cimarrones, Rebels and Plaintiffs, Strategies Enslaved Africans and Their Descendants Used to Resist Slavery in Puerto Rico, 16th to 19th Centuries by Daniel Morales Armstrong. A piece that I'm so intrigued by, the necessity of telling our similar stories by how we relate to the elements and survive the change of climate. So this piece is Forging Afro-Diasporic Bonds, Black Feminist World Making After the Storm in the Greater Caribbean, 1965 to 2017. Really talks about Puerto Rico, New Orleans, and the Virgin Islands. And this is a collection that is looking at Puerto Rican writers meditating on our African heritage, but doing so within the framework of the fluid, vast, expansive, almost infinite frame, an element that is water. So many of us see it as separation and containment, yet for our ancestors and for our survival as a people, and for what I discuss with Palestine, water, as I say it in my Brooklyn accent, is expansive and fluid, and therefore liberation. Another thing I wanted to mention with regards to envisioning liberation is historically the visuals that have been provided around liberation struggles and the imagery that have been connected to these struggles. So most recently, when I raised this example at the Trincheras de Ideas conversation on this same theme, what does liberation look like? I talked about having seen an image that said liberation, but it had barbed wire, the image or the sort of silhouette of barbed wire going across it. And I realized at the moment that barbed wire is not what I think about when I think of liberation. It's what I think about when I think of containment. So whether it's the barbed wire that you see across, say, Vieques, right, demarcating military properties, the properties that the military took from the people, or even if you think about agriculture and how, though it is beneficial to us, that barbed wire may represent containment to the animals that are penned within that barbed wire. I think of the image of AK-47s as connected to these liberation struggles. And so what I realized is that traditionally the imagery connected to liberation struggles has not been imagery that is related to liberation itself, sino la lucha por esa liberación. The images associated with these struggles are the icons of armed struggle, the icons of the struggle itself. So whether it be the things that contain us, the things that hold us in, oppress us, colonize us, and the weapons that are used in pursuit of that liberation. I use these as examples to discuss how there have been such few examples of images providing the visuals on what liberation could potentially look like, even if used as symbols. Clearly, we cannot get that one encompassing symbol or image to represent what liberation is for everybody. But it is perhaps an invitation to start somewhere and to ensure that when we use the term liberation, that we are not juxtaposing it with images of the opposite, images of our oppression, our colonization, our containment, that we are actually challenging ourselves to create a whole visual language around this new concept. And I say a new concept because we're all convinced that we have yet to achieve this thing called liberation. Right, so there's two ideas being thrown out here. Idea number one is that we are in desperate need, a more visual connection to what liberation is or could be or should be for us and what it is that we're trying to achieve. And the other idea being that liberation is not this distant state of being, but rather a practice that we must begin embodying in thought, feeling, and action from this very moment. One of the things that I've learned in my rematriation is that when I have felt most unsuccessful, when I have most felt like a failure, it has been for my inability to deliver on the criteria for success, the rubrics of success put forth by the colonizer. So whatever the colonizer has decided is the formula for success. The times that I have been most self-critical in the beginning of my move to Puerto Rico has been around, you're not making as much money as you used to over there. You don't have enough things as you used to over there. And then I realized that I was living up to a standard that wasn't mine. And that when I most came into resistance, it's because resistance is a very tricky word. But when I came most into resistance, it's because I was trying to carry out something that wasn't mine. And then there's going to be a natural conflict. So the importance of liberation being informed by what we ourselves need to feel free, to feel well, to feel at peace, to feel happy, to feel joyful, to feel pleasure, which might not look like for me as it would for you. But if we can connect to those things that bring us most joy and peace, then that should be the space from which we craft our definition of liberation. In order for me to feel free, I'm going to need this and this. And this is also important because if we're speaking of liberation as a practice from right now, then the way that you're going to do that is by defining that right now and then creating certain boundaries in your life. What are those things you're not going to permit? Because they're going to mess with your freedom. They're going to F with your freedom and they're non-negotiable. So you're not going to do this. You're not agreeing to that because you know it goes against your capacity to keep free, to stay free, to get free, to keep free. And using that now, not using, in order for me to be successful, I got to make this much amount of money. In order for me to be successful, I got to get this degree, this title. You want to do that, that's great. But we must give equal importance to what, in order for me to feel free, what would my day look like? How would my day start? Where would my day start? With who would my day start? What does that routine look like? Am I doing the things that are expected of me? Am I doing the things that I want to be doing? And what are those things that I want to be doing? There's a lot of us begin our subjugation and our non-freedom by living our lives and our days doing what is expected of us by others. And sometimes that depends because sometimes it's like parents or caretakers. And in certain jobs that we work, that we choose to work, like say teachers, then there are certain responsibilities that come with those things that we decided. Right? It's a byproduct of a choice we made that this is what we're going to dedicate our time to, or this is what we want to commit to. But we have to be very aware if even in those relationships we commit to, the work that we commit to, if it's como que se están pasando la gente, placing expectations that are unfair, that are unnecessary. And because of our love and because of our commitment, we're going to push ourselves to do those things that make us feel unfree. A lot of us, this is how they talked about it here when my kids were little in elementary school, which there's some weird things about colonial education. There's some weird things about the colonizers' education. And that is that they would speak to the kids about que es un deber, que es un deseo, que es un deber. What is a duty? What is a desire? Knowing the difference between those things. And that I could dig it. I could as a way to talk to kids about that difference. And the duty came around like, what does it mean to be a good member of society, a good member of your community, right? You don't want to litter. You don't want to be rude and like be a bully and stuff like that. And it's a duty to be courteous, to be respectful. And then what are the things that you do out of a desire to do them, out of your own desire? So having an understanding between those two things. And so all of this being that sometimes for us to understand what liberation looks like, and for folks thinking that that is a completely abstract concept that we don't know what that looks like until it arrives. My argument, though, is how is it supposed to ever arrive if we've never even tried to understand what it is that we want that to look like? And do we want a liberation to arrive that's been determined and decided by someone else that's not ourselves? Because are we in agreement with that liberation if it's been crafted by someone else? What we dream of, what we know that brings us joy, what we know that brings us pleasure, what we know that makes us feel most safe, is also what's going to make us feel most free. What we dream of, and that safety and that happiness and that joy and that pleasure and that goodness. And that is liberation. That is liberation. What are the bare bone things that I need to feel free? The questions that I pose here, where and when do you feel most free? Knowing what is it that you're doing? Where are you? Who are you with when you feel that sense of freedom in you? And likewise, pay attention and be aware of who are you with, where you are, and what are you doing when you feel least free? And having that awareness and then doing something with it. Like te vas a empezar a alejar de esa gente que, people make you feel hella contained, confined, constricted, suppressed, silenced. Those aren't your people. They're not working towards your freedom. And it's time to make an adjustment. And so to help with that, then the other question is, how does liberation feel in your body? So when I had that moment when I was in the water with my family, underwater, and I was like, this is what liberation looks like. And I, record scratch, everything comes to a screeching halt. I feel free. Let's assess this. Because we love to talk yang about everything that goes wrong, everything that we dislike, everything that they did to us, and everything that we're going to complain about. And so that we need to normalize those moments that I feel free right now. I feel free. Let me stop. Let me study this moment. I feel free. What does that look like? What does that feel like? Who am I with? Where am I? How does it feel in my body? Where do I feel my freedom? Do I feel it in my throat? Do I feel it in my heart? I know what my heart feels like when it's not free. I totally know what that feels like. Is it in my gut? Is it in my head? Is it in my arms? Where in my body does freedom live? What does it feel like? And when I don't feel free, what does that feel like in my body? Because if we could start connecting it to feelings inside our actual body, like to feel things, this is where embodiment comes in. Because we like to talk. We all have ideas, and everybody could pick up a book and read about all sorts of liberators and liberationists and liberation thinkers and activists y qué sé yo. I mean, like, well, this person said this and Alviso said that, y Betán se dijo y Lolita dijo. That's beautiful. But how do you take that into your own body? And if these people lived over a century ago, like in the case of Betances, then how do you reclaim that for yourself today with today's circumstances, which are dramatically different than the circumstances when Ramon Emeterio Betances was alive? So it's really important to start to define these things for ourselves and not just depend on books. And this is part of what it is to live in our heads. We read it. We talk about it. We talk about, yeah, this person did this person said that. But then there's a disconnect between here and here. And in order to live here, then your heart has no idea what your head is thinking. And you got to connect those two things. So you got to now start to think about, where do I feel this in my body? Where do I feel this in my body? What does liberation feel like in your body? Know that. And then it is to understand for yourself, how do you envision liberation personally? How do you envision liberation spiritually, if that applies to you? And by that, I don't mean religiously, whether it be energetically or whatever you believe, if that pertains to you. How would you define that? How do you define liberation politically? Now, the thing is that a lot of people tend to know this one, and this is where everyone stays. My liberation is, I follow this party, or I'm part of this organization, or this is what I believe. But no one ever connects that concept to themselves, to how they live in their bodies, to how they live day to day. How do they live with their families? How do they show up at work? How do they show up or don't show up with their own respective purpose in life, their own passions, their own joys? So liberation has to permeate every single thing, because this is how we live unfree. When we are separated more and more from it, we have to reclaim it in every aspect of our lives and existence and being, independently and collectively. So that brings me to the last one of this series, which is, how do we envision collective liberation, which is really hard considering that a lot of people don't believe what you believe. There's a lot of people right now that believe that they love having the military here in Puerto Rico, and they're okay with the United States invading Venezuela from Puerto Rico. There are people right now in Puerto Rico who believe that, and they're letting it be known all over social media. So how do you envision liberation for the collective when the collective might be complicit with the enemy, when the collective might be complicit with the colonizer? The last question is, how do you, or how can you practice liberation right from this very moment? How do you, for those of us who are already thinking these things and are aware of these things, how do we practice liberation in our daily day-to-day lives? That we're not waiting for a distant future when we're like 75 and someone decides to grant us liberation. How do we take liberation into our own hands in our daily lives from this moment, from every moment? Or, okay, I live a very oppressed life, but each day I'm going to do this one thing to give myself a liberated moment, because that's going to get me through to the next step. And I'm doing it a little at a time, right? We don't know what people's situations are. So I don't want to make it seem like this is possible for everybody, but it kind of is. It kind of is. In many cases, liberation is a choice. In many cases, liberation is a basic choice in terms of where you're living. For those of us who have the means to make a decision to live elsewhere. If there's a certain home you have to leave, if there's a certain relationship you have to leave, if there's a certain geography you have to leave. And then oftentimes that requires certain resources, right? So I've always said since I was very young that freedom for me is having options. That was how I would describe it. I now know that freedom for me is so much more, but I certainly was aware of how constricting it felt, how restricting it felt to not have choices that I could make or that were available to me, right? We always do have a choice. We always do have a choice, not always maybe the most radical choice that could help us radically change the situation we're in. But in terms of how we participate in something, how we respond or don't respond, or how we choose not to react to something, and that choice might be as basic, as simple, and yet as potent and powerful as making the decision to not react to everything that's done around you or to you, but how do you empower yourself from a liberated place to respond strategically, or to not respond strategically, because there's some stuff that is so trifling that doesn't even merit a response or an engagement, right? Sometimes you just have to remove yourself from a situation altogether. And so these are just, it's not meant to be one size fits all. It's just prompts that I'm throwing out for everyone within their respective situations, because our situations be hella diverse. And the most important thing about this is making this a practice that we normalize for ourselves, with each other, in the collective, to start discussing, what does liberation look like to you? That's like a good date question, like a first date question. Do I want to commit to this person? What does liberation look like to you? We got to know these things, because for some people, their liberation looks like someone doing shit for them, or their liberation is contingent upon or dependent upon everyone supplying it for them. And that's something you got to know, because I don't believe in liberators anymore. I have liberators that I am inspired by. I don't think that this new millennium is going to bring us new ones that are going to liberate us. I think that de nosotros depende. And so just have that conversation more. Think about it more. Talk to yourself in the shower, in the mirror, wherever you have to. Talk to your best friends. Talk to your partners. Talk to your coworkers. Talk to your families. What does liberation look like? Yo, for me, it looks like this. What do you think? Y ahí empezar from somewhere to normalize it.
From this land, these waters, to this forum, thank you for listening to my my reflections, my contemplations, and I hope that it inspires you to go deeper for those of you who are already having these conversations in your own heads and with your own respective peoples, wherever you may be. And that if you haven't had these conversations, an invitation to start considerándolo, thinking it, envisioning it, embodying it, practicing it. For more information about the project, you can visit Rematriating Borikén.com. That's Rematriating with an M and Borikén with K-E-N. And Rematriating Borikén is also on Instagram and Facebook. So you can follow us there. If you like this, please give a like and a share. If you want updates for future posts, subscribe to this channel on YouTube. And thank you again so much for listening. In light always. This is Yasmín.